Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Joined today not by the regular team because we're deviating off of history proper. If you can see the video here, I just did the air quotes around that. And bringing back a voice that I hope will sound familiar to some of our listeners, particularly if you go back to some of our earlier episodes. Ryan Cole is joining us today. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and Ryan tends to come on and talk baseball. And he reminded me as we were doing our pre-work here on the episode, all of the other things that Ryan has interests in and knows about. For example, Ryan has a degree in music composition. Ryan's an engineer. I know that he does things that are clerical, with his church and things like that. Ryan is the most Renaissance man that I know of here in the 21st century. But I tend to bring on Ryan to talk baseball because I know it's also a passion and a love for his, particularly the statistics of baseball, which not all fans. Baseball lends itself towards statistics. I think that's one of the draws or the magnets of the game for me. But not all baseball fans like the new sabermetric era, but that would be chasing a rabbit that some of our national listeners may not even know what we're talking about. So I'm just blah, 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 blah for them. But Ryan has joined us before a couple of times on baseball, actually, along with his father once, who's a good friend of mine. That's how I know Ryan. But also he's joined us for an episode on Star Wars. So as we were talking about also off podcast, I'll let Ryan say hi to the good folks here. Although you can't say hi to the good folks. That's Chris Capolla's line, Ryan. You can't steal Chris's way of introducing himself to our listeners. But Ryan also joined us for a Star Wars episode. I think it was episode 15. I think is going to be episode 208 or 209. So we put in a few episodes since then in the process.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. But as I was also telling somebody yesterday, so Ryan's good with galaxies long time ago, far away, and he's also good with baseball. And I wanted to particularly talk about this because it's timely. This episode should be somewhere around the Major League Baseball All-Star game, so it'll also be timely for that. And most recently, the passing of Willie Mays. And so we're going to talk about Willie today. But Ryan, I've been filibustered here for a minute plus, so I'll let you say hi to our listeners and welcome back.
Well, hello. I guess I can't say hi to the good folks, so I will instead say hello to the moral people.
There you go. I like that.
Yeah,
I like that.
maybe that'll be my
Maybe
spin-off.
that'll be your catchphrase. I think Ryan actually takes the lead again today on guest host appearances. So
Wow.
yeah,
Okay.
sitting at 4, I think you're the leader in the clubhouse at least. So we can go
Okay.
from there. So as I mentioned most recently, for those of us that are baseball fans, and I must confess, and anybody that's listened to the show knows that that's the case. Most recently, one of the all-time greats of baseball passed away. That would be Willie Mays. And I started thinking about his career, and I started, digging a little bit candidly into the stats. One of the bookmarks that's on the primary bookmark line of my browser is Baseball Reference. There's all kinds of sub-menus there, but Baseball Reference actually gets its own special button at the top because I go there frequently enough to do what I need to do there. Ryan is nodding his head. I think that's probably a thing that we share. And so I actually went back and started looking at Mays's numbers. And some things jumped out at me that immediately caused the what if mind that Don has because of A Fork in Time to start thinking about maybe a couple of historical what ifs of Ron. Maybe I want you to comment on this. Maybe we're going to that are of baseball significance, no doubt. But I think that they actually probably have some touchstones to maybe being of larger cultural significance, which is what to me makes this worthy of exploring because of the role that Mays had in the history and development of baseball, but also the unique timing of some of his feats and not accomplished feats relative to other feats. Am I going too far there, Ryan?
No, I think that's maybe a way to bring in people who aren't particularly baseball fans. Is of course it's history, it's baseball history, but as we know, baseball history and American history have closely been entwined throughout the existence of Major League Baseball. And as you mentioned it, and well, I don't know if you mentioned this, Willie Mays was a black man. Um, and as he began his career in the early 50s, not just, just a few years after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. Ostensibly, I think the first episode I was on was about did Jackie Robinson really do that? So
Right.
be a good one to go back and listen to
And
if people are
by the way,
interested.
I'll put a link in the show notes. That's episode 7. I just happen to know that one off the top of my head. So we'll put a link to that for those that might have missed it.
There you go. But yeah, how his feats as a black man on the baseball field, and how those accomplishments or theorized accomplishments were or would have been received reflects the status of the black man in America in that time and the type of reception he would have received. So no, I think that's a reasonable conjecture and a reasonable thing to tie in and connect to what we're talking about today.
Yeah. So again, we're going to take this from the what if perspective. That's what we do here at A Fork in Time. So this is doing a narrow historical what if. And so just quickly, we'll put links to, like, for example, his statistics in the show notes as well for the folks that don't know what baseball reference is. If you've never been there, you'll follow that link. And 5 or 6 hours later, if you're a baseball fan, you'll come up for air again, because the joy of hyperlinking, you'll go all kinds of places really quick. That's one of my favorite things about the site. But Mays is probably best known for being, at least in anybody's list, one of the top 3 players in Major League history. When we were talking about this before we were recording, Ron, the names you will hear there, without a doubt, you will hear the name Babe Ruth, because of all the things that Babe Ruth is. Babe Ruth is Babe Ruth. I mean, he's an icon again, even for those that aren't baseball fans. You will hear folks like Barry Bonds put on that list, with the controversies that go around Bonds in terms of the performance enhancing drugs and other things. How much of what Bonds did was Bonds, and how much of that was Bonds on, to borrow the term, Bonds on steroids, right? Or at least on human growth hormone. But almost any list I've ever seen has Mays in the top 3 of all time. Then you'll get into the question about recently Major League Baseball has added the Negro League records and consider them officially major leagues. I'm in favor of that. It complicates things when you go looking at numbers, because now you're mixing sources, but I think it's appropriate because the quality of ball that we know was played there and the quality of players that never got a chance to play anywhere else but there deserves their inclusion. But even if you go and add, somebody like a Josh Gibson, sometimes referred to as the Black Babe Ruth. I've heard folks rightly say, well, maybe Babe Ruth was the white Josh Gibson,
Yes.
kind of thing. Turning that around is Mays is going to, the point of all this, as I go on and on about, the point is Mays is going to make everybody's top 3 list for all kinds of reasons. That was because the term that's used in baseball most commonly is a 5-tool player. Those 5 tools encompass your ability to not only hit in various ways of hitting for average, hitting for power, which is not the same as hitting for average, speed, defense. What am I missing here? What? Arm, yes, thank you. Because we'll probably even talk about that in one of the most iconic things that go with Mays. The term 5-tool player, if it wasn't invented for Mays, you would have had to invent it for Mays, because it would describe what he does. And I heard when he is passing, somebody said he was actually a 6-tool player, because they talked about his baseball acumen and just his baseball smarts, which is a whole other thing that puts those tools to good use. So Willie Mays, there's no argument to be made. He is one of the greatest baseball players that has ever played the game. But he doesn't hold all of the all-time records. And during most of his play, he never really held any of the all-time records. We're going to talk about one in particular today. So everybody recognizes his greatness, but he's not at the top of a lot of historical career leader lists. Is that a fair way to describe it, Ryan?
Yes, and it's something that I think for a long time, and still to some extent today, he can be the type of player that can be overlooked. And I'm hesitant to say that about Willie Mays because, of course, he himself is not overlooked.
So you're telling me Mays is underrated? That's what you're telling me. After all that setup, he's
more
underrated,
or less,
right?
yes. He might be the best player of all time, but even that I think is still selling him short. Just in that, and what I mean by that, I guess, is that he did so many things very well, but wasn't necessarily the absolute best at any one of those things. But that's why you would, contrast him with someone like Babe Ruth, who is such a well-known power hitter, and he hit for average too. But was he a great defender or a great base runner? No. I don't think anyone would make that argument for Babe Ruth. So, as to why he didn't necessarily end up leading in any all-time stats, I think that's part of why. And then, of course, that doesn't diminish his value at all as a player. I think it, in a lot of ways, actually increases it, but in ways that maybe aren't always as immediately apparent. But I think some of the things that we're going to talk about today will actually get into a potential alternate history where he actually does end up leading in some of those areas.
Yeah. And the other thing we should mention here, this is not just common to Mays. There's a whole generation of ball players. The other one that is most prevalent to me when I think about this is another all-time Major League Baseball great, Ted Williams, in
Yes.
that The era
because he
of
missed time for
he
World War II
to
as well
and
as for the
as well
Korean
as
War.
Korea. And so you
Yeah.
have this phenomena where during World War II, a number of players lost seasons to
Mhm.
Major League Baseball continued in the United States during the war, but it was a different level of Major League Baseball because it were players that did not qualify for military service, which means you have to wonder just how good they were as athletes if they didn't qualify during a world war where any able-bodied person any able-bodied male was expected to do things, and females were taking jobs in the workplace previously done by men because that's what had to happen. But
Yeah.
you have some players that missed parts of seasons or whole seasons, World War II, and then and also into the Korean conflict era. And so Ted Williams, whole we could do a whole podcast could be done about Ted Williams. And by the way, there are enough Ted Williams stories to fill a podcast that would last forever. Many of them told by
Yes.
Ted Williams himself. But but Williams missed, seasons during World War II, during missed seasons in Korea where he was a pilot in both wars. And so you go back and you say, what would his numbers have been if he had had those seasons? And part of what prompted this, right, is I had not really realized until May's passing that he had gotten caught up in missing a season because of Korea. I didn't realize that he had lost essentially a season and two-thirds. He plays April and May of the 53 season,
52.
52 season. He misses all of the 53 season. Of course, the conflict comes to an end in 53, and he's back for 54. And when Mays comes back after his little jaunt over to Korea, is he any good, Ryan, in his 54 season?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about what Willie Mays did that year. In 1954, after having missed almost all of the entire previous two seasons, he led all of Major League Baseball in batting average. He led all of Major League Baseball in slugging percentage, which is a measure of how much power you have. He also won the MVP award, and oh, he was only 23 years old, by the way.
Yeah. This was
So
after
not
in
too
the
shabby.
Yeah, not too shabby. His 54 was a good year coming back into the game,
Yes,
and his
yes.
51 year, so the year before he left, he played April and May of
Mhm.
52 before going away. His 51 year, not a bad year. That was his rookie year, which by the way he won Rookie of the Year, which is
Yeah,
also
so
not too
also not
shabby.
too bad. When he
Yeah,
was 20 years old,
when he
by
was
the
20
way.
years old,
And for
and
those who don't know, that's an exceptional age to reach Major League Baseball.
yeah, yeah, the
Yeah,
absolute best players of all time tend to make the major leagues, around the age of 20 to 22. And that's
yeah,
considered early, even in today's way of fast player development and the other things that are there. It's rare to
right.
have somebody being able to play at a major league level at 20, let alone excelling in the
Yeah,
major leagues at the age of 20. That's a rare
absolutely.
event. So if we look at that, he missed prime years. And so then you start looking, this is when I realized that I'm like, oh, well, I know that he finished with 660 career home runs, which still places him high up on the list of all-time home run hitters. There's no question at all about him using anything that was performance enhancing. So you don't have that stigma, which is around, for example, a Barry Bonds that's higher than him on the list there, but people question how much of that is quote unquote legitimate. But I started thinking 714 was the magic number until 1974. 714 was the career home run total for the aforementioned Bronx bomber Babe Ruth, the most prolific power hitter known in the game by the fans, but also casual fans as well. And in early 1974, Hank Aaron surpasses that mark. In fact, in the first week of the season of 74, Aaron hits his 715th home run and becomes the all-time home run leader. Um, Mays plays through the 1973 season, finishing at 660. And so the first thing that popped in my mind was 660, 714, do the math, give Mays some homers for the seasons that he missed. We'll talk a little bit more about where you could also pick up some home runs. And maybe the person that passes Babe Ruth is not Hank Aaron, but maybe the person is Willie Mays. Is that
Entirely
is that
possible.
reasonable, Ryan?
I I think that is a reasonable inference to make, Don.
Yeah, and Ryan being the baseball statistic guy that I knew he was, that's why I wanted to have him on this. Ryan did the math using verifiable statistical interpolation approaches. You may argue with them, but they are defendable approaches. And I just casually mentioned to him in the pre-record, maybe for that missing season, maybe you give him 35 home runs from that. And then Ryan pulled up his spreadsheet showing me where he had actually done the math. And what number did you come up with, Ryan?
For 1953, he would have had 35 home runs by my
Yeah.
metric.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then you figure out how many more you're going to give him from the missing parts of 52.
Hmm.
And again, you only need the delta between 714 and 660. You've only got to come up with 55 home runs. And
Hmm.
so, as we were talking about before we started recording here, you just have to find 20 home runs elsewhere to have him by the end of his last season, the 73 season, knocking on the door of Ruth's record. And Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about the ballparks that Mays played in? Because they look a little different than what folks see today, right?
Yes, they were a bit unconventional. Willie Mays played for a team called the New York Giants. If you're familiar with a contemporary team called the San Francisco Giants, it is the same team. They moved out west in the 50s, I believe. Do you know what year that was, Don?
I think the move was in they followed
58?
58. They moved
Okay.
when the Dodgers moved because the desire to move
Yeah,
two franchises out of New York to the
right.
West Coast so that they wouldn't they wouldn't be prior to that. The furthest west team was St. Louis. That's hard to imagine.
Yeah. So when they were in New York, I'm sure this probably factored into their move to California. They didn't really have a designated baseball park as we would conventionally think of it nowadays. They played in something called the Polo Grounds. And as you may be able to infer from the name, it was used primarily for the sport of polo, um, which is where, the horses and I don't know what you call it, it's like a croquet racket kind of a
It's
thing. I
I
don't know
think
what you
I think
call
the technical term is mallet, but we
it.
probably we'll,
Mallet.
we'll
Okay.
stand corrected by our listeners. If you want to comment and tell us
All
that we
right.
got it wrong, let us know.
Well, I've just learned I'm not as genteel as Don because I didn't know the proper name for the polo mallet. So I'm learning. But this is basically just retrofitted to enable baseball to be played there. And typically, a baseball field, the dimensions, if you're standing at home plate and you look down left field, it's going to be about 330 feet, usually about the same to right field, 330 feet, and probably about 400 feet to center field, give or take. Um, Down left field, instead of 330 feet, what did we say it was, Don?
I'll have to pull it back up, but it was less down.
279,
Yeah,
277?
yeah. Let me pull it back up here. It was 277 to left down the
Okay.
line, so to the foul pole.
Yeah.
258 to right, so even shorter to right.
Yeah.
Uh, and then
But
to dead center field. And this is what I loved in the just in the quick Google search. I was pulling up the dimensions. I knew it was out there. It's 483. By the way, that's 147 meters for our international listeners. Just keeping that as
yes,
483 feet with a slope.
with the slope. Was that what ultimately inspired the original Minute Maid Park?
I know that there was a slope at Crosley Field in Cincinnati, then left field. So
Yeah.
un, un, generally today they try to get the ground as level or level with the drainage element, as much as possible. I know you know about moving water off of things, Ryan, because of what you
Yes.
do as a day job. But generally speaking, you don't, unless you're building the first version of the park here in Houston, or unless it's just by accident, you generally don't build a slope
Yes.
that's described as a slope into your dimensions.
Right. And so all this to say, especially for the maybe people who aren't as familiar with baseball, if Willie Mays batted in three right-handed, and most players tend to pull the ball, which means if you're right-handed, you're going to hit it to left field. If you're left-handed, you'll hit it to right field. Um, and what that kind of means for Mays is if he played half of his games at home in Polo Grounds, where it was 277 down the line, you only had to hit the ball 277 feet to hit a home run if you hit it to the right place, which probably would have been something that was natural for a lot of right-handed batters to do. However, if you hit the ball to the alley, somewhere between down the line and center field, it was much deeper. And of course, as Don mentioned, 480 plus feet to center field, which is 60 feet beyond the deepest center
I,
field right now, I think.
I want to say the deepest field in the majors now,
I
420-ish
think it's
sounds.
Detroit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sounds about right. And not
yeah,
only that, I'm looking here at the other dimensions, left center. So what are called the power alleys. Again, we
yeah.
stop here for everybody. We know what a power. Well, not all our listeners do. Power alley is basically to uh, bisect the lines in center field, and like a 45-degree angle off is more or less where the alleys would be, and it's where a lot of balls go because you don't
Yeah,
pull it right
pretty
down
much
the line.
between the left field power alleys between the left fielder and the center fielder, and same for
Right.
the right field power
So,
alley. Yeah,
so what's described here is left center. Basically, the power alley was
yeah,
450
So
feet,
very, very deep.
and right center was 449. So 50 feet deeper, 30 feet deeper, 50 feet deeper than the average depth of center field today, 30 feet deeper than the deepest ballpark in Major League Baseball today, to get to the area where a lot of balls go, particularly a lot of balls that are hit by power hitters, tend to be, they're called the power alleys for a reason. That's where the ball tend to go.
And maybe we'll touch on this a bit later too, but you can also start to understand why Willie Mays hit so many triples in his career as well. I think there were three separate times he led the league, and playing half your games in Polo Ground might assist with that a bit.
Yeah, because probably what he is best known, one of the things he's best known for casual fans, and this will probably be the image for the episode, if not other things, is what's known as the catch, which is deep in center field, World Series Game 1, 1954. He is somewhere between 430 and 440 feet away from home plate when he catches the ball. In most fields today, you would have had to climb the wall. You'd be, where the hot dog vendors are to make that catch today, because you would have been outside the field of play. He's not only still in the field of play, he's still got room to go as he's approaching the slope in center field at this point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a catch that would not be possible probably in any of today's ballparks.
Yeah. So what we were speculating is, in addition to the lost seasons where you can pick up, let's say, 35 of the 55 home runs that you need just in the games that he didn't get a chance to play.
Yeah,
But it's arguable that he played the majority of his career in a home ballpark before the move to California that was not as conducive for a power hitter to be able to produce, as you said. In fact, you probably could look at his triples and say, maybe half the triples deserve to be home runs, kind of thing, and extrapolate back from that. Maybe another way to do it,
yeah.
but not a hitter friendly park for the most part. Had hitter friendly elements. That left field line and the right field line are really close, but it gets deep really quick. And then when they leave New York, they go to San Francisco. And I never saw a game at the Polo Grounds because it doesn't exist anymore as a place to see a game. But I have seen a game in where he went to in San Francisco called Candlestick Park, which, if you know anything about the weather dynamics of San Francisco, that famous Mark Twain quote, my dad was actually stationed there actually during the Korean War. And he said he believed this quote. Twain is supposed to have said the coldest winter that he ever spent was a summer in San Francisco. And
I will say though, there's a bit of envy that I've always had growing up when we'd be enduring our Houston summers.
yeah,
And then you see the folks out there on TV when the Astros would play when they were in the National League, especially out in San Francisco. And you'd see the people all bundled up, and you just think, oh, if only.
yeah, and not just bundled up like casual sweater bundled up, like
But
parka bundled
scarves
up.
and
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, in July.
but
And
yeah, and but the effect, of course, you were going to say that has on because this is where Mays really played the bulk of his career from 1958 to part of 1972. He played there, and what was that like for hitters?
it was not good for the most part. I mean, like all ballparks, it has good days and bad days. But at night, first of all, the ballpark was known for its wind. So you have just the wind phenomena, how the wind is swirling and doing other things that affect. In fact, some of the best baseball blooper videos you'll ever see are watching people try to make routine pop fly catches and at Candlestick, because the winds are whipping through there. It's on a point out by the bay, and the winds. I may tell a story that relates to that for the one game that we actually saw there back in the day. But so during the day, not as much, but at night, and then it's cold. And as a general rule of thumb, cooler temps are not hitter friendly. The ball does not travel as well because of just the heat dynamics and what's going on with the atmospherics. The batter, feels more of a sting or a rattle from the fact that his hands are all kinds of reasons that it's not conducive to hitting, and may not be conducive to hitting home runs, just hitting in general. The story I was going to tell Rod is the day game we saw there in Candlestick. This was back in the late 90s. The thing that they did before the game, sort of the fan interaction stuff, was they had the pitching machine, like launching fly ball kind of apparatus, and they would get fans in from the stands give them a glove, and put them out in left field, and their job was to just try to catch a fly ball that was lofted into left. And if you caught the fly ball, it was a decent prize, for like the late 90s. It was a $100 gift certificate or something like this. And just watching regular fans who had probably played softball or baseball going, how hard can this be? You got an
Yeah.
appreciation for what I'd seen so often on the TV. The ball goes up and it just doesn't necessarily take the straight path down you'd think it's going to take.
Right.
So our argument was, we've gone the long way around the block. Now we're back at the front door. Our argument was that you only have to find 55 more home runs for Mays to have the chance to have broken Ruth's record in late 73. By the way, Aaron had drawn up to 1 home run short by the end of the 73 season. So we'll come back around to that. He breaks it in 74. But our argument was, I think we can find 55 home runs from the games missed, the park dynamics are there. We're just going to go into the assumption we found at least 55 more home runs for Willie Mays by the end of the 73 season. And we can, Ryan has a spreadsheet. We can bear that out. We can draw things on the diagram of the Polo Grounds to show you why that probably makes some sense, arc compared to a reasonable stadium. So jumping to that, Ryan.
Yes.
What was the fervor in baseball or in culture in general around the fact that Ruth's long-standing all-time home run record was under assault in the early 1970s?
Well, as you can imagine, there was a bit of opposition to it. The 60s are very well known for a lot of civil rights action, a lot of change happening in the country throughout the 60s and 70s. Um, I, I imagine a lot of the sentiment generally was just one of trying to, because I obviously was not alive at that time. I was born in 85. But I've read a book or two, and there was a lot of cultural tumult in that time, obviously not only with civil rights, but with women's liberation. And then, of course, with national things like the loss of innocence with the assassination of JFK in 63, with the Watergate scandal about a decade or so later. Um, just a lot of upheaval, and you can probably understand how a lot of people in this country had a sense of wanting something cherished that they could hold on to because so many things were changing or they were being disillusioned by other institutions that they had put their faith in previously. And one of those things I think for a lot of people was Babe Ruth's home run record. Because something else to recall too is in this era of the 60s and 70s, baseball was still the sport. It was called the national pastime for a reason. And I think at that time it was still considered as such. I don't think football had really sort of taken over so much of the national consciousness. Um, was the NBA even still the NBA and the ABA at that time too?
The ABA
Were the
comes
two?
along a little bit later. Yeah, but you're in that
Okay.
era. Yeah, the NFL was on the rise. College
Mhm.
sports was college sports, particularly college football was big. But probably if you
Yeah.
talk to, just like it is now, there were a lot more fans of college football than the NFL at that point. The NFL
Yeah.
AFL merger had just recently. Yeah, baseball is the long-standing professional sport king
Right.
at that point.
Right. It's a quintessentially American thing that if anybody who's seen the Ken Burns baseball documentary, and if you haven't, even if you're not a baseball fan, it's worth a watch. Will know that this stretches back to even the Civil War and earlier in this country playing the sport. So it's something that had been around in America for over a century by the time we're getting into the early 70s. And of course, Ruth's record had been around since the 40s.
Yeah, I think
Did he
his
play?
last season is there in the latter 30s. So yeah,
Okay, okay.
yeah.
So yeah, a very hallowed record, one that Babe Ruth, as you mentioned, was not only a great baseball player, he was a celebrity, and that this is maybe an apocryphal story, but it's something I've seen more than one place that this is in World War II, and when the Americans were fighting against the Japanese and they wanted to get at their ire, they would say to hell with the emperor. And the Japanese, in turn, would not say to hell with the president. They would say to hell with Babe Ruth,
Yeah, yeah, because
because that
that
was
was
really
that was a
angry.
big. It was much more powerful to insult Ruth than it was to insult Roosevelt. Right at that point,
Right.
made a lot more
Yeah,
sense. Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
Well, actually,
Um,
I hadn't even thought about this until you triggered it there. But talking about Ruth's hallowed, the other record that Ruth held related to home runs again, and the home run being the showy thing,
yes.
offensively, statistically, it's the
Basically, what Babe Ruth invented. more or
Yeah,
less.
yeah,
Yeah,
well, true, yeah, because when Home Run Baker, whose nickname was Home Run Baker,
yeah,
before Ruth comes along and led the league one year with like 12 or something like that.
yeah.
Then Ruth comes along and hits 60 of them in a season. So there were two Ruth home run related records. One was the single season record, and then one was the all time record. We're talking about the all time
Right,
record here, but the single season record was in 60, came under assault in 61
right.
by Yankees. Ruth had played most of
Yeah.
his career with the Yankees, and that's Mantle and Maris that are chasing that. Several good movies about that as well, including the movie 61 with an asterisk that does that. But to give you an idea how hallowed that was, the season had been expanded from 154 to 162 games. And so the commissioner of baseball, who was a Ruth guy that went backwards in time with Ruth, said, "Well, if you don't break it at 154 games, you haven't broken it." That's what the asterisk is about, is that you had an extra couple of games to do it. But there was a lot of hoopla. That's a word I'll use that I don't get to use very often in the real world.
Yeah.
There was a lot of hoopla around Mantle and Maris chasing
Again,
Ruth's.
showing your genteel nature there, Don.
There you go. There you go. And
Yeah.
also my age a little bit, Ryan. But there was a lot of hoopla around that single season record when Maris and Mantle were chasing it. Again, because they were chasing whose record? Not just any record. They were chasing Ruth's single season record.
Right.
And so fast forward to the early 70s, as you described very well, not being alive. I was only alive for part of that, but I think you described it very well. There was this idea of wanting to find something that was consistent and held on.
Hmm.
Nostalgia is always a powerful thing. That's a whole other
Yeah.
discussion we could have, but there was nostalgia around that. Maris and Mantle were, just to put it bluntly, white guys chasing a white guy's record. We get to the all-time home run record in the early 70s. Babe Ruth, white, eventually is run down by Hank Aaron, a fantastic ball player, but who is black. And we talked earlier about Mays being black. So assuming that we have Mays in position by giving him these additional home runs to be knocking on the door and potentially taking the record in late 73, when Aaron did it, what was going on around that for Aaron before we talk about Mays here, Ryan?
Yeah. So when Aaron, so as you mentioned earlier too, Aaron finished the 1973 season with 713 home runs, one short of tying Babe Ruth's record. And internally for him, that was something I think that gnawed away at him throughout that entire offseason. It was really unfortunate timing for him because I think he very much just felt the weight of that eating away at him throughout that entire offseason and, of course, into the 1974 season. Um, but also, we didn't mention who Aaron played for. He played for a team called the Braves, who started out in Boston and then went to Milwaukee next. Is that right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And then later on to Atlanta. And at the time, 1973-74, the Braves were in Atlanta at this time. And if you mentioned a bit about Hank Aaron's own internal struggle, predominantly, though, I think people are aware of and considerate of the external struggle that he had because he was a black man living in Atlanta, Georgia, playing for that team. And here in 1974, he was about to break the most hallowed record in baseball that was held by an esteemed white man who, as we mentioned, was more than just a baseball figure. He was a national figure, a national hero. And so, as you can imagine, he received lots of letters. And many of them were not letters of support, but letters of, uh, using racial epithets against him, threatening his life, threatening the lives of his wife and children, um, just completely deplorable things. But all of these racist threats coming into him certainly would have had an effect on his life and his family's lives and how they felt of his pursuit of this baseball record.
Yeah. So that was what Aaron experienced in the real timeline. In our alternate timeline here, I think we both agreed Aaron still probably eclipses taking the
Yeah,
taking the record. Just
yeah,
not taking it away from Ruth, but taking it away from the recent all-time home run leader, recently obtaining the title Mays, and then takes it on from there.
right.
So
Something, by the way, we didn't mention about Hank Aaron is that he ended up with 755 home runs,
yeah,
which even I think if with our concessions about Mays, he probably still ends up short of Aaron's
right,
record.
right.
So
So
yeah,
Aaron becomes the all-time home run leader.
yeah,
Agreed. and Mays only probably gets a fleeting hold of the title. I mean, it's we I think we will even talk about that. We talked about that a little bit more coming through here. But the
Mhm.
would it have been different for Mays than Aaron? I guess that's the question that you and I had talked about off podcast, which is what I found most fascinating about this, other than just changing the fact that Mays would have had that record, even if only briefly. But would what we saw in 74 with Aaron have been different for Mays in 73?
Yeah, and that's for so many reasons. It's an interesting question to consider because Mays, of course, debuted earlier than Aaron. I didn't see. Let me pull up when did Hank Aaron debut. Um, but Mays debuted in 1951, and yeah, Aaron debuted. It looks like in 1954.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so in 1951, this is important because this is just 4 years after Jackie Robinson debuted for the Dodgers, who were just across town from Mays' Giants in New York. And the interesting thing about that, though, is that although Mays debuted earlier than Aaron, my impression is that he didn't receive as much of the hatred, or he was just far more insouciant about it. And that's something that's so noteworthy about Willie Mays' style of play and something that's so remarkable. I mentioned to you earlier, Don Joe Posnanski, who's a sports writer, a contemporary sports writer, to us, ranked Willie Mays as his number one player of all time. And one of the things that he talks about at length is just the feeling you got from watching Mays. Um, and Mays had the style of play that was just effervescent and overflowing with joy and a childlike glee and pleasure in just playing the game. Of course, that's probably a lot easier to have when you're as good at it as he
right.
was. But he was definitely a guy for whom it didn't seem like at least to be a job. It was something that he would have done, I'm sure, if he didn't make any money. He did it for the love of the game itself. Um, and a lot of that was sort of exemplified in one of his trademarks was this cap always flying off. We've talked about his great defensive ability, and I can't remember who it was, a contemporary of his that said that Willie Mays wasn't the fastest man he ever saw, but he was the fastest man when it came to chasing down a fly ball.
Right.
And that part of his cap flying off and him just having a great time and going all out with it is a trademark of his play. So it seems based on what we know of Mays' character, and we didn't talk about his nickname. What's his most well-known nickname, Don?
He's the say hey kid.
The Say Hey Kid. And do you know the story of how he got that?
I just in my mind realized I really don't.
So the one I've heard is that he was sort of a celebrity in his day too. We talked about how big Babe Ruth was, but Mays was very well known and very well regarded.
And in New York, by the way,
Yeah,
at this point.
yeah. That he was always being introduced to so many people that he couldn't ever remember everybody's name. So he would, instead of saying your name when he would greet you, he would just say, "Hey, how you doing?" or "Hey, how you been?" And of course, that was attendant with that tone of voice and with that excitement he was to be talking to people. Um, as you mentioned too, after games, sometimes he would still go out into the street and just play stickball with the kids because I think he was also just such a people person, very much like Babe Ruth in that way. Just love the crowds, love being around people, and this joy that he took and this ebullient nature that he effused from himself, uh, I think was captivating and very endearing, and I think kind of made you want to root for him. So when you talk about breaking that hallowed record of Babe Ruth's, I do wonder if he would have received as much hate because his character and style of play was so different from Aaron's. And also if he would have at least outwardly weathered it better because again, he had this insouciance, this sort of unflappable joy that he carried with him every time he played the game. And not only that, but as you mentioned, it probably would have been a short-lived holding of the record that he had, because it probably would have been late in 73, and Aaron probably still would have broken it, if not in 74, then 75 for sure. Um, and if him having broken that record and gone through what he might have gone through, if that would have perhaps even then helped Aaron endure it a little bit better, knowing that here's someone else, another black man who has gone through this sort of thing of breaking this hallowed white man's record. He's someone in whom I could confide, find some camaraderie, someone who has been there and can empathize.
Yeah, and,
What
and
do you think?
I agree with that, and we talked about that a little bit before the podcast, which is again one of the things I wanted to talk about here. So obviously that's why we're focusing on it. And then the other, just the shift in geography. When the Giants leave New York, they go to San Francisco.
Mhm.
So is San Francisco perfect in terms of racial relation? No, no, we still aren't there yet as a nation in the United States in 2024. So I don't have illusions about 1973 San Francisco being utopia when it comes to that. But I also know that 1973 San Francisco was different than 1973 and 1974 Atlanta. Just not without going
Yeah.
deeper than that. That's just the reality. And so
Mhm.
you have this beloved figure who, as we just talked about here, had a different personality, and as a result, had a different public persona. Those two things go together. Not
Yeah.
and Aaron, I'm very impressed. One of my most treasured things, I actually have a Hank Aaron autograph that
Oh, wow.
one of the people that used to work for me got for me. That I treasure. That it's literally right here up above me to the right. So I keep looking up to the right because I know that Hank Aaron's signature is right there. But just very different personalities. Aaron was much more introspective, was not all of that. And then the difference between being in Atlanta and being in San Francisco, I think also would have altered the way that played out. And then there's the possibility that, very much like the Maris Mantle chase of the single season in 61, that what you actually end up in 73 is Aaron's drawing up on the record. Mays is drawing up on the record. There's this little
Mhm.
bit of who's gonna get there first, which by the very nature of it would have taken pressure off of Aaron, because it would have at least been split between the
Right.
two of them, if not, shifted over. The idea that it would have fully shifted to Mays may be a little bit of an incorrect assumption, because what it may have been is just, which one's going to, it would have been the contest of which one's going to get there first,
Right.
versus who's is it going to be done, versus not a question of is it going to be done, but who is going to do it, and those are different questions.
Yeah. And who's going to get there first? Um, and another factor that might play into that too is we might have alluded to, he didn't finish his career. I can't remember if this was before we started recording, but he didn't finish his career in San Francisco with the Giants. He played with the Mets for part of 72 and then in 73 as well, back in New York at Shea Stadium. And you do wonder then if the Giants saw how close he was to Ruth's record, if they would have tried to hold on to him. We've seen this in recent years where these aging players who probably should retire get a couple years added to a contract or get re-signed, because if they break a big record, that's going to put butts in the seats.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
and
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 so that may have
it,
been a factor though too, because I don't know the details of Shea at that time, but I'm sure it was a more hitter friendly park than Candlestick was, and so that might have been
having
difficult.
having seen games in both parks, that's one of the places I can't. And by the way, both of those stadiums are no longer where those Major League Baseball teams play. So my list
Yeah.
of trying to see games in all Major League stadiums keeps lengthening, because some of the ones I've knocked out no longer are where teams play. But Shea was a pitcher. I think slightly a pitcher friendly park, or at least a neutral park. But you're right. I
Yeah.
don't think it was as hitter unfriendly as Candlestick was. And of course,
Right.
this is an aging Mays. And the other thing that jumped out at me when I was looking through the stats there after the day that he died, Mays' 1973 season is not the Hall of Fame level numbers that are being produced, but I
Right.
know his OPS plus was over 100, which means he's an above average hitter, even if just by a little bit, or he was near that mark.
Well,
And
that's his 72 season.
72 season, okay,
Yeah,
73.
his 72 is very good. I mean, he limited playing time, but 1972, yeah, 131 OPS plus. So for those who don't know, OPS is a measure of how much you get on base and how much you hit for power. And the OPS plus statistic just compares you to league average, where
Yeah.
100 is average. So he was 31% better than the average player when he was 41 years old.
Yeah, and to put it in perspective for his entire career, that again, I like to use the plus stats because it automatically builds in the relativity for you, right? That's why I love the plus stats. Overall,
Mhm.
his OPS plus for his career 155. So he's
Yeah.
he's a half a person, he's a half a major league ball player better than the average major league ball player is, one way that you
And
can
that's
think of
just
it.
in terms of hitting, not to mention he might have been the greatest defensive center fielder, a very important defensive position in two very difficult parks to play center field.
Right.
But
Of
maybe in
all
the
time.
greatest of all time. Yeah, greatest of all
Yeah,
time.
no,
Yeah.
no doubt about
Yeah.
that. And so to me, it got interesting as I was thinking about the story. I know we're bouncing around. So I think about the historical what if. To your point, I think he probably remains a giant. And
Hmm.
that may make it a little bit more difficult for him to be chasing the wreck, or easier one way or the other. It probably alters the situation there. He was no longer playing the outfield on a regular basis. He had shifted to being a first baseman just because
Right.
he's a 40-year-old.
Right.
But he's still capable of doing that. But
Hmm.
this suddenly this idea of the 73 season being about Aaron and Mays chasing down Ruth collectively is a very
Yeah.
different dynamic than the Aaron drawing up close in 73. And then, as you point out, having the entire off season of personal angst about I didn't get this done. I've got to come back and do this. The hate
Yeah.
mail, the pressure that was there, all that went with that. Just a very different dynamic. And again, I don't think when Mays passes, we would say that much different about him in terms of us that were fans that we see in the media. They would still say he's one of the greatest players of all time and all this other stuff. But one of the mentions there in the first couple of paragraphs would have been in the story at one time, but could have been at one time was the all-time leader,
Yeah.
in home runs. That you wouldn't have skipped over that, even while you're hitting all the other accolades and lauding all the other things that he did on the diamond.
Yeah. And something maybe to think about too is I'm sure there was already a reinvigorated um, sense of interest in baseball among the general public, given what Aaron was doing in the actual timeline. But given my age, I very much remember the home run race of '98
Yeah,
with all those guys. Because, of course, McGuire and Sosa, I think, are the two people remember most, but there were others involved in that for a while, too. Ken Griffey Jr., for one. And, of course, that was following the strike, and that was a big part of kind of rekindling that interest in the national pastime. And, of course, baseball was competing more with football, or NFL particularly, and NBA at that time. But to have two guys simultaneously going after the record in baseball, I mean, I can't imagine how much more that would have elevated things. I'm sure that would have been a really interesting thing to watch at that time.
yeah, and of course the other connection we mentioned him in passing here. Statistically, it's hard to argue against Barry Bonds and his numbers. Whether those are aided by, whether it's better baseball through chemistry or not is a whole other, debate. That's an entirely different thing we could talk about. But his numbers are incredible. But because Bonds played the majority of his career, particularly the majority of his career when he was hitting home runs, as a Giant, with
Yeah.
Mays having been a former Giant, and Mays is actually his godfather, and so there's this connection, this generational thing, which is one of the things I love about baseball. There's this generational connection, the overlaps of eras, fathers and sons sharing this passion, that kind of thing. But there's that
Mhm.
idea of Mays, his connection to Bonds, how that sort of permeates on down through history is an interesting phenomenon as well.
Well, and one thing we mentioned off broadcast too was the Bill James statistic, the power speed number. For those who don't know Bill James, he is the father of sabermetrics. Um, I don't agree with everything he says and the way he looks at some things, but he was certainly an innovator. We have a lot of our, I think, better and more accurate contemporary statistics. We have him to thank for those. But the power speed number is basically a way to measure and appreciate players who excel at both their speed, measured through stolen bases, but also through their power, measured through home runs. And the top five of that, to talk about those three players, or two players you mentioned, but one we didn't. So Bill James created that statistic to measure how good Bobby Bonds was, who was Barry Bonds' father. Also a very good player, borderline Hall of Famer. He's fifth on the all-time list. Mays, as we're talking about, is number three on that all-time list. And Mays, as you mentioned, is the godfather of Barry Bonds, who's number one on that all-time list. So not only is there that sort of familial connection between them, but their styles of play were also very similar as well, as indicated by that factor.
Yeah, it's again, one of the things I know you and I both love, and those of us that are passionate about baseball and why we love the statistics is we try to measure the capability of these players across eras, and that's tough because the game has changed and altered, and so you have interesting debates about does that number mean what that number means now compared to what it meant then, and there's all types of there are books after books after books and the work that James did and others did, trying to do this. But generally speaking, some of those statistics do a pretty good job of trying to normalize the things that have changed over time so that you can actually
Yeah.
say, a Babe Ruth in 1927 versus a Willie Mays in 54 versus a Barry Bonds in what 2003, 2004 through
Yeah.
that era
Any of
there.
the early 2000s. Yeah.
Yeah, when 73 is that the number? Because I don't think of it as the official number
Yeah.
for reasons I don't think of it as the official number. When 60 was a number, Barry took it to 73 and did it well within 154 games, and did it probably seeing one pitch to hit a game,
Yeah.
and still
Yeah.
managed to do it.
Yeah.
I've often said there, and I know this is sacrilege among some of my baseball purist fans, but even if Bonds had gone to the plate with a little IV pole, directly connected to the drugs, the fact that he had one pitch to hit and he crushed it, 450 feet, you know, there's something to be
Yeah.
said for that, right?
Yeah. And that's something we didn't acknowledge either, but maybe should point out. And I think I may have even contradicted this earlier when I mentioned Hank Aaron's home run total. Ba Barry Bonds does have the single season and career home run records, 73 for a single season, 762 for a career. Um, so some people will dispute those numbers for many reasons, but in the record books, that's what they are. And I won't get into my feelings on Bonds because they are complex also.
Yeah,
But
and
just in terms of what you'll actually see if you look up these numbers and who leads, that's what you'll see. So just
yeah,
to put that up there.
and then we hit it in passing here, but one of the things that's happened this year is Major League Baseball. I mean, I mentioned it has officially recognized statistics from the Negro leagues, which have been
Yeah.
tough to compile over time because they weren't kept the same way in what's there. But they now consider those to be major league statistics, and so some of the positions on some of those lists vary depending on whether you filter the traditional historical major leagues versus the new things that are there, and then you get into a whole argument about the most prodigious Japanese hitter of all home run hitter of all time, Sadaharu Oh, I know had well over 800. I don't know what his number is. That's okay, that's not counted. Maybe it should be now. This is the debates will always continue around baseball as a game, but also baseball and its statistics because it's such the hallowed lore of baseball is how we measure. Guys are known by their numbers. DiMaggio is 56 because of the hitting streak. Ruth was 714 or 60 because of the home runs. Ted
Yeah.
Williams, huh?
Bob Gibson is 112,
Yeah,
for a lot of
yeah,
people.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. For a 1968 ERA, that
Yeah.
don't get me talking about Bob Gibson. We'll be here another hour, Ryan, because I look at those numbers and I didn't see him pitch, but I look at those numbers and go, that wasn't a human. That couldn't
Yeah.
have been a human. That's
Yeah.
something, that's something out there. And I do regret, tying it back to what we talked about here. I wish that I would have had the opportunity to see Mays play in
Yeah.
his prime. There's certainly there's film of it. Later there's video clips of it, but just seeing him run down one of those balls in the Polo Grounds in the ballpark, where you can
Yeah.
really appreciate the scale of what you're
Because
seeing here.
even watching the grainy, incomplete 1954 footage of that catch is impressive. But I can't imagine watching it like in HD nowadays, and then even more, as you mentioned, actually being there in the park and seeing how far out that center field stretches and him patrolling it so effectively like no one else.
Yeah, it's one of the things that draws me to baseball. Obviously, I have a passion about it. You can hear it in my voice. Probably one of the things is that it's the statistic of the game within watching the game actually being played is it can be a beautiful, almost uh, you know some people enjoy the ballet. I enjoy the 6-4-3 double play. Kind
Yeah.
of thing. In terms of just the choreography of what goes on with that and the timing and what you see there. And
And
I
that's
think,
a shortstop to second base to first base for
yeah,
those of you scoring at home.
and actually scoring at home because that's where the
Yeah.
6-4-3 and actually you might argue that the 4-6-3 might be sometimes more impressive because of the way that it comes across. But then now we're
Yeah.
getting into we're not just as one of our listeners quoted on Discord when I asked a question about this. Now we're really quote unquote inside baseball when we're talking there. We are way off. We know we're talking to a small subset, particularly the audience of this podcast. But I do regret not having seen because I've seen great players, modern great players play. I saw Bonds play. And I saw Bonds hit balls distances. I saw you mentioned Sosa there. In the home park here in Houston. I was in the stadium the night, didn't actually see it because I had gone to get something from concessions for my young daughter at the time. So I blame the co-founder of this podcast, Alexis, for me actually seeing this to a degree in the ballpark. but there's a Sosa during one of those years when he was with the Cubs actually hit a ball to left field in Minute Maid Park that was way up in the light stands. It's probably the most prodigious shot that's ever been hit in Minute Maid Park. I was in the ballpark
Heard
that night,
about this
Ryan.
home run.
I was
Yeah.
in the ballpark that night, but I was not in the seats to see it that night. But when you
Mm.
come back to the seats and realize where it went, you look and you go, "That's just not possible." But it was, and I
Yeah.
think that 54, the quote unquote the catch, what Mays is known for. People look at that and go, if they were in the park, they were going, "There's no way somebody can catch a ball out there that was more or less a line, an extended line drive, which is what it was to get that far." All right. Any closing thoughts, Ryan, before we shut it down?
Um, I don't think so. There are more kind of baseball-y aspects of it that I could get into, but I'm not sure how much that would be to of interest that would be to the general listener. So I'll leave them off for now because there's one other anecdote about that catch I'll share with you maybe
Well,
off
go ahead and
record.
do that, and we'll let that list close out, Ryan. I'd love to hear
Okay.
that.
Well, it's regarding that 1954 catch, and this isn't necessarily about Willie Mays necessarily, and I don't remember the name, so you have to pardon me that, but in 1954, this is a game in the World Series, which that catch was instrumental because it ended up keeping the game, I think, tied, and the Giants went on to win in extra innings and ended up winning that World Series over the Cleveland Indians at that time. And and the Giants were the underdog. But when Mays made that catch, I believe it was a left-handed batter who was batting, and a left-handed pitcher had come in just to face that batter. He's a left-handed specialist. And the pitcher, pitches the ball and the hitter hits it, as you said, 440 feet or so, which would be a home run in pretty much every park ever. And Willie Mays makes the most incredible catch of all time. It's known as the catch, as we've said several times. It's how iconic it is. And given the situation and what ended up happening after, maybe the most important catch of all time. Um, Gets the ball back in, keeps the runner from scoring, all these big things. And then after that, I think a right-handed batter comes in, so they pull the lefty. And as the lefty's walking off the mound and the new pitcher's coming in, he just says, "Got my guy," as
I
if he
think,
had done something, worthy of merit and
yeah,
hadn't
I
been
think
bailed out by the
now that you've
greatest
told the
catch of all
story,
time.
yeah, now that you've told the story, Ryan, I think I do remember hearing the story,
Yeah,
and the fact that you can't even remember who the pitcher was, but we can remember who made the catch, sort of illustrates the point of why that was an out, right? That out had
yeah,
nothing to do with the pitcher's capabilities at the end of the day. It had to do with what Mays did defensively. That is a great story, and also
yeah,
the fact that it's just a great story. And the
yeah,
other thing I know you mentioned in that same story off podcast, because it's referred to as the catch, but a lot of baseball historians will talk about the way that he immediately turned around and threw the ball back in, which was a
yeah,
tremendous throw. Remember how far away he is, not just from home
hmm,
plate, but from second base, from the infield.
yeah,
This is a substantial throw just to get the ball back to the infield and to do so. And you
yeah.
mentioned this, which I think I knew this, but I had forgotten until you mentioned it. Larry Doby, also an important figure in baseball history, particularly for breaking the color line in the American
American
League,
League. Yeah,
is the player that was on second base. And you were talking about the fact that Mays later said, I kind of knew I was going to make the catch, which is incredible, right? But he
right.
said the thing that was running through his head was that he needed to turn around and immediately throw, because even though the runner would have been tagging up, which is what you again, I'm not gonna, if you don't know baseball, you have to go look that up. I can't go into all that. But once the catch is made, the runner can then advance, assuming he stayed on second base, which probably Doby hadn't. He probably had already started breaking for scoring. Doby gets from second to third, tagging up on the fly ball. But
Yeah,
that's only because Mays turned around and whipped the ball back into the infield to keep Doby from scoring from second, which would have been a legitimate thing for someone of
yeah,
Doby's speed. And again, back to Mays's baseball acumen, is that Mays, okay, I just made this incredible catch, but there's a really fast runner on second base that if I don't turn around and make a great throw, he's going to score anyway. I made the catch, but it's not going to matter. The runner is going to score.
yeah.
And that was
And to put some numbers to it too, from home plate to the pitcher's mound is 60 feet, 6 inches. So from home plate to second base is about 120 feet. And if we're saying if we're being generous and saying it was only 420 feet where he caught this, May still had to throw the ball back in 300 feet,
right,
which
which
is an incredible throw.
yeah, which is the length of an American football field from goal line to goal line,
Yeah,
or we're coming up on the Olympics here, so roughly the distance that they will compete this little thing called the 100 meters over. he basically threw
Yeah.
the length of that race.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
again, just incredible. Ryan, thanks for joining again. Really good to have you. I hope our listeners didn't mind too much that we took our little sports baseball deviation here, but hopefully we tied it back to the historical significance enough that it's relevant, or maybe you learned something, and maybe we'll suck you into this game that we all love at the end of the day. So again, on behalf of the Fork in Time, Ryan, as a guest, we just want to say thanks to our listeners for listening. If you have feedback on this, we invite you to go and check us out on our Discord. You'll see the link to that in the show notes. That's where our listeners do gather, and they provide feedback and they provide topical suggestions. And even though podcasting is a one-way audio medium, we try to make this into something that seems like a discussion and a conversation, and we're getting better at that. So we welcome you to go to check that out, or check us out at our webpage, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. And one of the recent things done there, I don't think I've mentioned this on air yet, but I spent some time in the last couple of weeks updating our index there. And so one of the things you're able to do is now go back, and you can't really sort it as much as I'd like to. We still have some more work to do there, but you can easily go back and go through the past episodes. So you can find Ryan's episodes, for example, pretty easily. And when you find an episode you like, they have not just our titles now, but our topic descriptions, who's on the episode, and you can click directly there to link to listen to the episode, which you weren't able to do before. So if you need to catch up on the 200 plus-ish episodes of A Fork in Time and you don't want to listen to all of them, I don't expect you to listen to all of them. Some of them are not worthy of going back and listening to again. But if you're looking for some interesting things to pick out there, you can find Ryan and some of the other topics that relate to that. And if you're a baseball fan, there's a smattering of 5 to 6 episodes. Ryan's been on some of those, but I know I did one about the 1919 White Sox scandal and some other things there. So you can go pick that out. But most of all, we thank you as listeners for your time and attention. And as we always invite you, if you come upon that fork in history, I suggest as much as just go ahead and take it. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.